Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Reiser in for Allison Morris. You're watching NBC News Now. Here's what's happening. The U.S. and China bumping heads over a hack attack. The White House pointing the finger at hackers working for China, accusing them of helping to extort U.S. companies.
97% of the hospitalizations that are occurring right now are occurring among unvaccinated people.
It feels like deja vu. Hospitals getting hit with an influx of COVID patients as cases rise in all 50 states.
We see cases currently who've been tested before departure who are now not coming, the most obvious today being Coco Gauff, the tennis player.
Tennis star Coco Gauff and a member of the women's gymnastics team. COVID is already sidelining athletes. We'll tell you who's in and who's out. We start today with the latest on the hack attack. NBC News correspondent Ken Delanian is in Washington, D.C. So, Ken, the U.S. calling out China over a ransomware hack on Microsoft's email server. That emerged back in March. So remind us what happened and why the U.S. is naming China now.
That was a big attack, Lindsay. It affected more than 100,000 servers worldwide. But it goes well beyond just that one attack. What the U.S. has done today in concert with its allies is say publicly for the first time that they believe that Chinese intelligence agencies have been working with criminal hackers who are out to commit crimes for profit. In other words, not about spying on Americans or the United States government, but about ransomware and cryptocurrency hacking and extortion and all kinds of bad behavior. They're saying essentially the Chinese government is operating like a crime family online, and they want them to stop. And this is the first time that the U.S. government has ever said anything publicly like this. Now, notably, Lindsay, what did not accompany this announcement was any consequences for this action, any sanctions. That remains to be seen whether the Biden administration will take that action. They have sanctioned Russia over cyber misbehavior, but the U.S. has never levied sanctions on trading partner China over hacking, Lindsay.
Okay, so what's China saying about the accusation?
China has always denied that it participates in cyber crimes or espionage, hacking. But look, I mean, the U.S. has long complained about theft of intellectual property. In other words, Chinese intelligence agencies hacking companies and stealing trade secrets. But this goes even further. They're saying not only are they doing that, some of these people are moonlighting as garden variety criminals, and they are sharing vulnerabilities that allow criminals to use ransomware to extort American companies for millions of dollars, Lindsay.
Well, separately, the Justice Department indicted 4 people for allegedly working for Chinese intelligence to hack into companies. What charges are they facing?
They're facing computer fraud and economic espionage charges. And this Justice Department announcement was timed, obviously, to coincide with today's big Biden administration push against China. It's a slightly different from what the Biden folks were talking about. It's sort of standard economic espionage where these people were accused of hacking into American companies to gain advantage for Chinese companies. Now, we see that as out of bounds. The U.S. doesn't do that for American companies, but unfortunately, China views that as part of national security. They view it as their job as an intelligence agency to help Chinese companies. And so the U.S. has never been able to resolve this disconnect over how both countries view espionage differently, Lindsay.
You know, today at President Biden's press briefing, somebody asked him, a reporter asked him, what's the difference between what we're seeing with what China's doing and with what Russia is doing? And the president said, basically accusing China of abetting these ransomware attackers, not just knowing about it, not just essentially doing hands off, but actually helping them. So what is the administration talking about in terms of their approach to dealing with China's attacks if sanctions haven't been thrown out yet?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, Biden's comments, actually. The administration is saying, first of all, it's important that they have enlisted allies. The EU, Britain, Japan, the first time ever that NATO, for example, has condemned Chinese cyber misbehavior. And they're saying this is a first step in a long battle to sort of turn world opinion and get China in check. But I want you to take a listen to what President Biden actually said, because it was actually slightly more cautious than what his own aides were saying on the record. Take a listen.
To the best of my knowledge, and I'm getting a report tomorrow morning on this, a detailed report, my understanding is that the Chinese government, not unlike the Russian government, is not doing this themselves, but are protecting those who are doing it, and maybe even accommodating them being able to do it. That may be the difference.
You know, actually, Biden aides went further than that, and they said specifically that China's Ministry of State Security, one of their big intelligence agencies, is working with criminal hackers to extort millions of dollars from Americans. So perhaps the president wasn't fully briefed on that, but his own people went further than he did in that bite, Lindsay.
Yeah, and he'll be getting that full report tomorrow. All right, Ken Delanian, thanks so much.
You bet.
Fears of a COVID resurgence saw a huge sell-off on Wall Street, with the Dow plummeting more than 700 points today. Still, recent months have seen an economic comeback. President Biden is touting a job surge, saying we've gone from adding 60,000 to 600,000 new jobs a month. And Biden says we're making big progress and can do even better. NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memley joins me now. So, Mike, President Biden, he's touting his American Rescue Plan, saying it's helping with job creation. He slammed the so-called trickle-down economics. So what's with this plan in terms of short-term and long-term growth?
Well, this is obviously, Lindsay, a critical week for the president and his spending proposals as the Senate is getting ready to have the first of what I promise you will be many test votes for the various plans that he's put forward. And part of the president's argument today was to point back at some of the criticism he was facing as a candidate and as a young president in the early days of his administration, that the $1.9 trillion COVID recovery plan was too much spending and not enough to address the economic needs. Part of his argument now is that my critics were wrong then, and they're wrong right now. Take a listen to part of his argument.
It turns out capitalism is alive and very well. We're making serious progress to ensure that it works the way it's supposed to work, for the good of the American people. We brought this economy back from the brink, and we've designed our strategy not only to provide for a temporary boost, but to lay the foundation for a long-term boom that brings everyone along.
What the president was really trying to accomplish today was to get at the heart of what is the chief Republican criticism of his more than $4 trillion in spending plans, which is that it's going to accelerate the rate of inflation we've already seen. The president saying, yes, we've seen some price spikes, but these are only temporary. These are brought about by the fact that the economy is now really revving up after the pandemic. And he made the point that by making the kind of targeted long-term investments that he's proposing on things like childcare, on transportation infrastructure, on revitalizing U.S. manufacturing, that it'll provide more sustained growth that will lead to greater productivity, that will ultimately lower prices in the long run, Lindsay.
Yeah, that human infrastructure the Democrats are hoping to work through budget reconciliation. So, Mike, I want to switch gears here. The president has been making moves to start closing Guantanamo Bay since last month. And today there's been a big development. The Biden administration transferred its first detainee from the facility. So who got transferred and where are they going?
Yeah, the transferee in this case, his name is Abdul Latif Nasser. He's going back to Morocco. The Moroccan government, as part of this agreement with the Biden administration, is agreeing to take him back into the country. Now, what's interesting is this is all part of a Biden administration effort that's picking up where the Obama administration left off 4 years ago, trying to close down Guantanamo Bay. And now there are 39 detainees who still remain at Guantanamo Bay. And I want to run through some of the numbers that administration officials gave about what happens now. They said that 10 are eligible for a similar kind of transfer that Latif Nasser went through right now, that 2 have actually already been convicted. And so it remains to be seen what their next steps are of the crimes that they were accused of. And 17 are eligible for the same kind of review board that led to Latif's release at this point. Now, I should note, Latif Nasser, he hadn't actually faced a specific charge, but he had been held at Guantanamo Bay for 19 years. So it speaks to exactly why the Biden administration, like the Obama administration before it, wants to slowly wind down its presence there.
Well, and Mike, also today, President Biden is hosting King Abdullah II of Jordan. In fact, at that press briefing I talked about with Ken, a reporter said, we have all day for you to answer questions. He says, no, I've got to meet with the King of Jordan, which is like the most presidential thing a president could say. But this is the first Arab leader to visit the Biden White House. So what's the team saying about the importance of this meeting?
Yeah, significant meeting, especially if you remember what was going on a few months ago when we had that conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the rockets being lobbed back and forth. It was the King of Jordan, who has always really been a key ally in the region, a sort of a rock of stability in that part of the world. But it's notable that he comes to the U.S. at this point when that stability has been called into question. So this was an important, really a photo op. We didn't really hear much of substance in the brief opportunity that reporters had to see them together. But I will also note that who else was part of that that photo op? It was the 27-year-old son of King Abdullah, who is the crown prince. And so this is speaks to, I think, the message that Jordan really wants to convey here, which is a stability. But naturally, part of the agenda is focused especially on what the path forward is in terms of Mideast peace and what Jordan can do in terms of the flare-up we've seen in militias taking aim at the U.S. presence that remains in Iraq.
All right. You covered a lot today. Mike Bumley, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Texas Democrats are kicking off their second full week in Washington with a conference on voting rights. The group is bringing in speakers from around the country to shine a national spotlight on this issue. NBC News Now correspondent Priscilla Thompson is in Georgetown, Texas. So, Priscilla, this conference, it's now mainly virtual. At least 5 of those Democrats tested positive for COVID-19 over the weekend. So tell us who will be a part of the conference here, and do they think it will help with their efforts to get a federal law passed?
Yeah, Lindsay, that's exactly why this ended up being a mostly virtual conference, because of those emerging COVID cases that we are seeing there. And this is going to be a conference where these lawmakers are meeting with labor advocates, voting rights advocates, election officials, other lawmakers. And it's all in an effort, they say, to prepare them for the fight ahead as it relates to voting rights here in Texas. So those members met with Dolores Huerta today, a very famous labor leader. Later in the week, they're going to be meeting with legislatures from Georgia, other places that have passed those restrictive voting laws, including Florida and Arizona, to talk through how those states are grappling with those changes and how those Democrats plan to move forward there. And so that is really what Democrats are focused on this week. We think that we might also see a few more meetings with lawmakers. So we're waiting to hear more about that, but not letting these COVID cases sort of slow them down, continuing to do the work that they went to Washington, D.C. to do, even if it is virtual. Lindsay?
And Priscilla, can you give us an update on how those are doing? I spoke with Texas state lawmaker Gene Wu yesterday, and he said they were vaccinated. So the good thing is that they have, mild symptoms. Is that still the case?
Yes, that is what we're hearing. Those 5 who did test positive, the symptoms are mild. They were vaccinated, and they, of course, give a lot of credit to that. And it's interesting that you spoke with Representative Wu, because he tweeted about this, saying that, Democrats let their guard down when they got on that plane without those masks on. That's something that, regular Americans are not even allowed to do on commercial flights. And so we're sort of seeing some of the potential ramifications of that. And we know that 2 of those Democrats who did test positive have self-identified, and that's Celia Israel and also Representative Trey Martinez Fisher, both of them saying that they recognize sort of the sacrifices that they would be making in coming and going to D.C. and some of the risks. And, of course, COVID was one of those risks, but that it is worth it. And so they are quarantining until they test negative, and then we expect that all of these folks are going to be back out there holding these meetings in person, trying to bring awareness to their cause, which is voting rights. Lindsay?
Yeah, no, I'm wondering if they were maskless on the plane because they all thought they were all vaccinated, but we do know that there still are those breakthrough cases. Priscilla, you've been speaking with voters in Texas today. What do they think about this standoff now entering its second week?
Yeah, so, for the past week, Democrats have said that, or those Democrats who are in Texas have said that their voters support them in this effort, and that they told them to go and that this was the right move. But, of course, Republicans here have been saying, no, voters feel like you are walking out on the job that they have paid you to do, and it is certainly going to be reflected in re-election efforts. And so we wanted to get on the ground outside of Austin to hear directly from those voters. So we're about a half hour outside of Austin in Georgetown, Texas. This is an area that is represented by both a Republican representative and a Democrat representative who's currently in D.C. And I want to play some of my conversations with some of the voters that we've spoken to here on the ground.
When the Republicans have stalled, they will read Law and Order or some other long book and just stand there, which wastes time. So Democrats are doing it their own way, that they can push forward through what's important to them.
I think I'm not in favor of the voting rights legislation at all. I'm not sure that I'm in favor of decamping and the game of chicken that's going on in the State House. It's just the word I come up with is unfortunate.
I would like to see people come together on this, and let's just make it easy to vote. But yes, make it secure. That's fine. But let's not make it harder to vote. That's not what this is all about.
And so what I'm hearing from a lot of folks today is that they'd like to see some sort of bipartisanship on this voting legislation, because they're not really sure how all of this ends at this point. And I did ask all of those people you just heard from if they would still vote for those Democratic lawmakers currently in Washington, D.C., and they told me that they would. This has not turned them off against potentially voting for those folks. But of course, I did speak with some Republicans here who had very strong feelings about this, saying that they feel like the Democrats ought to get back here and do their jobs. Lindsay?
And all of them say they're not doing that until that 30 days of the special session is up. All right, Priscilla Thompson, thank you so much for your reporting. A new book about former President Donald Trump out tomorrow claims his behavior just before and after losing the election had the nation's military leaders concerned. NBC News senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson has more.
Hey there, Lindsay. From two Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post reporters, this account of Donald Trump's final year in office. Part history book, part current events, detailing the actions of a former president who right now is considering another run for office and the intense fears of some of those in the highest positions of power.
81 of them.
For Joint Chiefs of Staff Chair General Mark Milley, concerns of a coup felt so real he warned aides they may try, but they're not going to bleeping succeed. You can't do this without the military, adding, we're the guys with the guns. Milley, so worried about Donald Trump's behavior before the election, he compared it to Nazi-era Germany. Quote, this is a Reichstag moment, the gospel of the Führer.
The general saw other ways in which Trump was trying to create fear and chaos to capitalize on it. They were afraid of what he might do.
That explosive reporting from Philip Rucker and Carol Lennig, their new book based on more than 140 sources.
Carol and I were both surprised overall in this reporting by how much worse things were behind the scenes than we knew in real time.
New details now about the president erupting at top military brass and Vice President Mike Pence after they resisted his suggestion to deploy troops to go after Black Lives Matter protesters. You are all bleeped up, Trump thundered. Every one of you is bleeped up. Later telling the authors one of the only regrets of his presidency was not overruling those advisors to put troops on the streets. Also revealed, the origin of Mr. Trump's big lie, sparked apparently by Rudy Giuliani on election night, demanding they declare victory even with ballots still being counted.
The big theme in this book is how unnerved and unsettled even the most ardent supporters of President Trump were, privately, secretly, behind the scenes.
People will want to know, then why didn't you say something at the time to these officials that were so close to the president? It's not a profile in courage to come out after he lost an election and now talk about it.
They were afraid of this president, and they wanted to cling to their own power.
Milley, through a spokesperson, declining to comment. Mr. Trump has since denied any talk of a coup.
He has a big constituency out there, and it's worthwhile for all Americans, whether you support Trump or not, to look back and study what he did to really understand the consequences of his decision-making and of his actions in office.
Despite leaving office with an approval rating in the low 40s, the former president is also apparently feeling confident in his presidency and his own popularity. At one point in that 2.5-hour sit-down at Mar-a-Lago with the book's authors, Mr. Trump suggested if George Washington came back from the dead and chose Abraham Lincoln as his vice president, it would have been very hard, he says, for them to beat him.
Let's now go to NBC News Now correspondent Simone Boyce. She's following the latest headlines from NBCnews.com. Happy Monday, Simone.
Hey, Lindsay, same to you. All right, we start in Tokyo, where Olympic athletes aren't the only ones making news. A judge sentencing an American father and son to prison in connection to former Nissan chairman Carlos Ghosn's escape in 2019. Now, the father, Michael Taylor, is facing 2 years in a Japanese prison. His son, Peter, will serve 1 year and 8 months. All right, this is a wild and inspiring story. New York City police releasing footage over the weekend showing an officer saving a man's life by using none other than an empty bag of potato chips. The police officer was responding to a stabbing call when he jumped into action to try to stop the victim's bleeding. Here's what he did. He taped a Lay's potato chip bag over the wound. Now, the victim's physician said that the officer's actions contributed to his survival. And a steamroller in Malaysia crushing more than 1,000 Bitcoin mining rigs seized by police. Now, this happening after miners allegedly stole $2 million worth of electricity siphoned from power lines. This electricity theft causing 3 houses in the city to burn down, according to police there. And in England, people are packing clubs and taking newly reopened tours on what many are calling Freedom Day to celebrate newly lifted COVID restrictions. But the day was overshadowed by a surge in daily cases, shortages inside supermarkets, and the Prime Minister's own forced self-isolation. And for the first time in history, Sports Illustrated is featuring a transgender model on its annual swimsuit cover. Model Lena Bloom is also the first transgender person of color featured in Sports Illustrated's pages. Naomi Osaka and Megan Thee Stallion will grace the other 2 covers. Lindsay, I'll send it back to you.
I've talked to Lena Bloom before on MSNBC, and her story is just so inspiring. And she's so humble. She's in a movie. She's got this cover. I mean, now is her time, and she's still like, I can't believe this is happening. So I'd love to see somebody who's successful and taking it all in stride. Simone, thanks.
Yeah.
The Olympics are meant to bring the world together, but for some athletes, the road to gold was bittersweet this year. Asian American athletes facing racism during the pandemic here at home, while working so hard to represent the U.S. in the Games this year. NBC News investigative correspondent Vicki Nguyen has their story.
These are some of the Asian American athletes representing Team USA in Tokyo.
This is something that I've dreamed of since I was a kid.
Representing the U.S. and representing the sport is very special.
Tokyo in Japan is such a special place to not only play volleyball, but it's a part of our family history. To represent America going there, it's so fitting.
It's such an honor, and to do it on a world stage like in Tokyo is such a cool thing. I'm so excited.
But even as members of Team USA, they aren't immune to anti-Asian hate. They saw the headlines and viral videos as verbal and physical assaults against Asian Americans rose sharply. One group tallying more than 6,600 hate incidents from March 2020 to March of this year.
You're a loser. Go home. Loser. Go home. Stupid.
Sakura Kokumai, the first karate Olympian named to Team USA, was training at a public park in Southern California when a man harassed her. Yul Moldauer, born in South Korea and adopted by Peter and Orsa Moldauer, is a proud Asian American. He detailed a similar experience in Colorado.
This lady cuts me off, and, at the next red light, she screams out her window, "Go back to China."
Paralympic tennis star Dana Mathewson is Chinese American. She was diagnosed with transverse myelitis, which affects the spinal cord, when she was just 10 years old. She says she's been the subject of Asian jokes, made mostly by people she knows.
Friends have joked to me like, oh, did you bring COVID here? The jokes from my friends were not made with any malicious intent. But that goes to show that people don't really understand the gravity of what they're saying.
Do you have conflicted feelings going into this Games because of the rise in anti-Asian sentiment?
No. I think that I'm so proud of the fact that I'm Chinese. If anything, it's just another opportunity for me to show people what we're capable of doing.
Brothers Eric and Kavika Shoji are sharing the volleyball court once again, this time in the land of their ancestors. Growing up in Hawaii, they say they were mostly shielded from anti-Asian sentiments.
Coming from Hawaii, there is such a melting pot there. The Asian community is just hugely woven into the culture of Hawaii. So we personally haven't experienced too much of the negative.
But when a Serbian volleyball player made this racist eye gesture during a match against Thailand earlier this year, it hit home.
To see someone do that gesture on the biggest stage that volleyball has to offer at the moment was insane to me. So I needed to say something. I wanted to say something. FIVB and the VNL has decided to suspend the Serbian libero 2 matches, along with fining the Serbian Federation. So it was appalling. I put a lot of things on social media about it, and hopefully some things can change from that.
How does it make you feel when people question your identity as an American?
I feel like me going into the gym 7 hours a day is one of the most American things to do, is to grind your heart out every single day to get an opportunity to wear USA on your chest. You know, it sucks to know that there are people like that, but you know, at the end of the day, I try and not let that affect me. I just think about all the positive people that have stuck by my side.
Sakura says that April day only motivated her to keep going.
As athletes, we always tend to use whatever obstacle, make that into strength and power, and just keep moving.
And Vicki joins me now. I mean, Vicki, those stories were really hard to hear. Those videos were hard to watch. You know, we heard one of those athletes saying it was kind of fuel to focus on competing. What did the other athletes tell you about how they were able to deal with those moments and then get their focus back?
Lindsay, really good to be with you. And I have to say, something that struck me after speaking to each of those Olympians and Paralympians is what they have in common. Even though they have diverse perspectives and experiences with racism, they are all athletes for a reason who've made it to this elite level. And that is, they don't take that negativity and let it get them down. Really what they do is they turn it around, they use it to motivate themselves and to get past it. What I also really appreciated is how much they were willing to use their platforms and their voices. This is a new generation, I think, of athletes who are willing to speak on difficult topics, who aren't going to shy away from controversial subjects. In this case, you know, they're athletes, but they're also Asian Americans, and they're Asian Americans first. And they weren't afraid to call out people who are questioning their identities when they're actually trying to represent this country.
You say this is a new generation. So what about the older generations, their families? What do they think about them speaking out?
Yeah, I think this is so interesting. A lot of the reason why these athletes also felt motivated to speak out, not just to educate people and to let the world know what's actually happening, but was also to protect their families, their parents, their grandparents, because that's who they're seeing when they watch these videos of these attacks. This could happen to any of their family members. And so I think it's out of a protective reflex. And they said that this is part of just who they are and what they want people to know, that it's not acceptable, this kind of discrimination. Their families have provided endless support. We've talked about this before. Asian culture can be one that really doesn't emphasize raising your hand or putting yourself out there. And I think that's part of why their voices are so important, making this known, making this acceptable to have a dialogue on.
Yeah, I mean, we see these Olympians and they're literally on a pedestal, right? But you brought so much humanity to them with your reporting. Vicki Nguyen, thank you so much. We'll be cheering them on. Well, another Olympic athlete sidelined because of COVID. U.S. basketball player Katie Lou Samuelson now unable to play in Tokyo, joining a member of the U.S. women's gymnastics team and teen tennis star Coco Gauff. NBC News senior national correspondent Tom Yamas has the latest from Tokyo.
Good day from downtown Tokyo. We are following all those breaking developments concerning Team USA's women's gymnastics team. An alternate on the team testing positive for COVID, now in quarantine at a hotel. We also understand another alternate on that team was a close contact. That person is also being monitored right now. Team USA saying the core 6 gymnasts, which includes Simone Biles, for now, they are all okay and they are still training. They hope to compete in the Olympics in the coming days. And we are just days from competition getting underway, but we've learned more than 60 people involved with the Olympics have tested positive for COVID here in Japan. That includes 2 soccer players from South Africa. The entire team has been deemed close contacts, so now they're quarantined. They have to test negative before they can compete. And now a new rule for the Tokyo Games: the other teams they play against, the other countries, have to be okay getting on the field with them. So a lot is changing. This is a very dynamic and fluid situation as we head into competition here in Tokyo.
Well, another Olympic athlete sidelined because of COVID. U.S. basketball player Katie Lou Samuelson now unable to play in Tokyo, joining a member of the U.S. women's gymnastics team and teen tennis star Coco Gauff. NBC News senior national correspondent Tom Yamas has the latest from Tokyo.
Good day from downtown Tokyo. We are following all those breaking developments concerning Team USA's women's gymnastics team. An alternate on the team testing positive for COVID, now in quarantine at a hotel. We also understand another alternate on that team was a close contact. That person is also being monitored right now. Team USA saying the core 6 gymnasts, which includes Simone Biles, for now, they are all okay and they are still training. They hope to compete in the Olympics in the coming days. And we are just days from competition getting underway, but we've learned more than 60 people involved with the Olympics have tested positive for COVID here in Japan. That includes 2 soccer players from South Africa. The entire team has been deemed close contacts, so now they're quarantined. They have to test negative before they can compete. And now a new rule for the Tokyo Games: the other teams they play against, the other countries, have to be okay getting on the field with them. So a lot is changing. This is a very dynamic and fluid situation as we head into competition here in Tokyo.
A nationwide COVID resurgence. Cases are on the rise in all 50 states. Hospitalizations are up too. The sickest patients are almost all unvaccinated, according to the CDC. NBC News correspondent Gabe Gutierrez has more from Jacksonville, Florida.
A gnawing sense of COVID deja vu. For the first time since January, new daily cases are rising in all 50 states, fueled by the highly contagious Delta variant. In Jacksonville, cases are doubling each week. UF Health, like many hospitals, is seeing younger and sicker patients.
We're seeing overwhelming numbers, and this surge is a lot faster, and if I can use the word, a lot meaner than last time. Things are worse.
Nationwide, COVID cases are up nearly 70% over the past week. Hospitalizations are up nearly 36%. Deaths, 26%.
California is open again.
A month after California essentially put COVID in the rearview mirror, the pandemic has boomeranged in the state. Los Angeles, the nation's most populous county, just reimposed its indoor mask mandate, even for vaccinated people, as it deals with 1,000 new COVID cases each day.
I'm afraid this mask is going to start to adhere to my face.
Over the weekend, 5 Texas Democrats who traveled to D.C. to stall their state's controversial voting rights legislation tested positive for COVID, even though they'd all been vaccinated. Today, Illinois will announce the winners of its statewide lottery for frontline workers in an effort to encourage them to get the shot. Around the country, vaccination rates have dropped by more than 35% over the past week. In part, the White House is blaming disinformation shared widely on social media platforms.
What's your message to platforms like Facebook?
They're killing people. I mean, look, the only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated. And they're killing people.
Facebook firing back, saying it will not be distracted by accusations which aren't supported by the facts. The social media giant says it's removed more than 18 million pieces of COVID misinformation.
With coronavirus cases on the rise across the U.S., the American Academy of Pediatrics is recommending every child older than 2 wear a mask at school this fall, regardless of vaccination status. Medical Director for Gramercy Pediatrics, Dr. Diane Hess, joins me now. Dr. Hess, the American Academy of Pediatrics here saying masks are necessary because the student population, much of it at least, isn't vaccinated. What's your take?
You know, I am not certain that everybody has to wear a mask who's unvaccinated. That's my personal feeling. Now, that's not the AAP's feeling. Other countries who got this pandemic under control did not have kids wearing masks in school. They had adults wearing masks if they were unvaccinated, and they had other good hygiene and air ventilation systems in place. I feel that mask wearing for children in school, especially ages 2 and up, is very difficult. The mask is soggy, it's wet, they can't learn speech, they can't learn facial expressions. I have kids who are not thriving in school. They are, even in the daycare, they did not, during the peak of the pandemic, in the daycare in New York City, babies and kids did not have to wear masks, just the teachers did. There were no outbreaks. So my personal opinion is the adults who are unvaccinated should wear a mask. Kids who are vaccinated should have the option if they want to. Anybody can send their child to school with a mask. Ultimately, it's going to be the school district's decision, not my decision, right? But I personally feel that I don't know that the masks are doing any great deal of good for younger children, because I feel that my patients are sicker from RSV, from Coxsackie virus. They're sicker from flu, and we don't make them wear a mask for flu. So why are we making these children wear a mask for something that the adults are really getting sick from? It should be the adults taking the responsibility.
Well, so what should the CDC do? Because they said that vaccinated students do not have to wear masks in the classrooms. I mean, here we have this new recommendation here from the academy. Should the CDC update their guidance?
No, I agree with the CDC. I think that in the classrooms, the children don't need to wear masks. They need to learn. They need to see their teachers, and they need good hand hygiene, and they need good air circulation and windows open. But I do not think that the children are the source of this pandemic. And we've said it over and over. You know, here in New York City, we've had some cases here and there now in camp. They're unmasked, but we don't have 10 cases in camp. We have 1 case because the kids are not the ones who are transmitting it. They're getting it from their parents.
Well, and is it also fair to say that it's because camp is mostly outdoors?
Yes, but there's the daycares and things that are, excuse me, for the younger kids are still indoors. And there's not a huge spread. I'm just telling you, that's what we see. And I feel that the drawback of a young child wearing a mask all the time in school is huge. I feel that they're not learning to speak, and they're suffering. And they have, many other infections. Like we have kids with fungal infections on their face and skin infections. And, it's not about the breathing. Everybody can breathe with a mask. It's just that is the benefit outweigh the risk? Flu is much more dangerous. RSV is much more dangerous. We don't make our kids wear masks for those things. Yet we make them wear a mask for this virus, which is really the burden of the adult. I think what this country needs to do is step up like Europe. Find people who are not vaccinated. Do not let them go to bars. Do not let them go to concerts. And if you let them in, you get fined. You know what? Then people, the adults who are the burden of this disease, will get vaccinated. Money speaks.
Yeah, I mean, of course, vaccine passports, like that idea, it's already been, essentially banned in a couple of states, including Arizona and Florida. But real quick, before we let you go, Dr. Hess.
Sure.
As a pediatrician, what's your advice to parents who are nervous about sending their kids to school in the fall? I've talked, just like you, I'm sure, to parents who both say, my kid thinks the mask is no big deal, or my kid absolutely hates it. What's your advice to parents?
So I think a parent has to do what's right for their family. First of all, if your school mandates it, you have to wear a mask. If your school says masks are optional and you're too nervous, put your kid in a mask. Nothing's going to happen. Put your kid in a mask. It's what's good for you. But if your school mandates it, you're not going to have a choice. Your kid has to wear a mask, and you're not going to get out of that, which is fine, because my ultimate goal, right, is to have all kids in school. That is the number one underlying thing. We need kids back in school. But, it's unfortunate for all those high schoolers who have been vaccinated. They're going to be punished for the adults' irresponsibility, and they have to wear masks. It's really not fair what we're doing to these kids. We got it wrong last year when we closed the schools. And I think, again, we're getting it wrong. We have to focus on the adults. We have to make them responsible to get vaccines or have some kind of consequence if they're not. But to make children get a vaccine or to wear a mask for a virus that really has less than 0.001 mortality for children, nothing like the flu or getting pneumonia or many other illnesses in children. Once again, we're using the children to control this pandemic, which really isn't being spread by them. That's how I feel.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hess, for your honesty and for answering all of our questions on this today. We appreciate it. It is time now for the bottom line, our daily look at what's going on in the business world and beyond. Big things on tap this week: earnings reports, housing data, plus a rough start to the week on Wall Street. The Dow ending the day down nearly 726 points over renewed concerns about the rising number of COVID cases around the country. CNBC correspondent Rahel Solomon joining us now with more on all these big stories. So, Rahel, let's talk about the markets here, all the major indexes plunging. What's going on, and what does this mean for economic recovery?
Hi, Lindsay. Yeah, well, as you said, it does appear tied to the concerns about rising COVID cases, slowing economic growth. And as the day went on, the sell-off continued. The Dow having its worst day since October, the S&P and Nasdaq having their worst day in the last 2 months. Airlines, part of that sell-off, as investors start to question whether travel will continue at the same pace among this rise in cases. United, Delta, American all finishing the day lower by about 5%. Boeing also falling by about the same. Now, at the same time, those stay-at-home stocks, companies like Peloton and DocuSign, they closed higher today. Now, in terms, Lindsay, of the outlook moving forward, I think it really just means that as long as this pandemic is still a concern, we're going to continue to see market volatility like we did today.
A lot of these airlines betting against all of that, some of them investing in all these new planes, saying travel's going to bounce back. But investors are bracing for a busy week of earnings here. Who will we hear from, and what will you be watching out for?
Yes, well, we're going to hear from a lot of companies, nearly 1/3 of the Dow and 76 companies from the S&P 500. So we just heard from IBM after the market closed today. They reported, I think, about 30 minutes ago. Tomorrow, we will hear from Netflix, Chipotle, and United Airlines. Wednesday, there's Coca-Cola, Johnson & Johnson, and Verizon. They all report. And then on Thursday, we'll hear from AT&T, American Airlines, and Twitter, just to name a few. Now, Lindsay, despite it being early in earnings season, we've already heard some companies talk about raising prices to account for inflation. Some companies, though, also saying that maybe they were too slow to raise prices and discussing the impact that that's having on profits. So I think we'll be looking for more talk on how companies are responding to inflation and what that means for prices moving forward, for the consumer especially, and also what that means for profits for investors moving forward.
We're also expecting a few economic reports. Data on new home sales is out tomorrow. Thursday, existing home sales plus building permits and mortgage applications are set to be released. Why are these numbers also important?
Yeah, well, I think it paints a bigger picture of what's happening in the real estate market, right, which is so important in terms of the economy on a larger scale. So, yeah, we got a flurry of housing data this week. Today, we received home builder sentiment. That suggested that home builders continue to be thrilled with all the buyer demand, not as thrilled about higher construction costs. One thing we continue to look for, though, is the lack of inventory due to high housing demand and slowing construction.
Rahel, we know women have been hit especially hard on the job front because of the pandemic. And there's a new report out from the International Labor Organization, and they say men will find jobs more quickly over the next year than women. Why is that? What's the real issue here?
Yeah, it's an interesting report. So it suggests that while projected job growth of women in 2021 will exceed that of men, it actually won't be enough to bring women back to pre-pandemic employment levels, although we will see men's employment return to 2019 levels. The report essentially finding that women not only suffer a greater loss of income, but also continue to take on most of the unpaid care work. The report, though disturbing to some, not necessarily super surprising. People have been sounding the alarm, the she session, as it's been called, about the disproportionate impact that the pandemic would have on women in the workforce and how that impact could be longer term. So it's certainly something to watch. It's an interesting report, but perhaps, sadly, not that surprising.
Yeah, hopefully employers are listening. All right, Rahel, thank you so much. Detroit's segregated past taking on new meaning. The Burwood Wall, built nearly 80 years ago to help keep black residents out of one neighborhood, is one of the last relics of segregation in the North and is a reminder of the lasting consequences of racist policies. A local artist painted it in 2006, and it still serves an educational role today.
The wall is directly across the street from my house. I can stand in my front door or in my front living room window and I can see the wall. One question people always ask me is, do you want the wall to be torn down? No, I don't. The history of what went on, why it went on, and how we can change things, that history needs to be told. I've been here for 62 years. We moved out here in February of 1959. When we moved over here, the wall was there. We didn't know what it was.
This is the Burwood Wall, part of Detroit's 8 Mile, Wyoming neighborhood. Built to separate black residents on one side and white residents on the other. A housing developer built this wall in 1941 in order to guarantee mortgage loans for white families in a new development to the west. Loans black families were denied at the time.
When you see the Burwood Wall, you kind of think of a southern water fountain or a cafeteria counter. You think of an artifact that would be more associated with segregation in the South. You don't think of it in the North. But to see the construction of a segregation wall like this was an absolute slap in the face of black Detroiters, first and second generation, certainly.
I think people feel differently about this wall than they do about other symbols because, for one thing, there's a beautiful mural on the wall that depicts something positive. It depicts happiness, togetherness, joy, peace, love, whereas other walls gave a sense of something dark and ugly. Even though the Burwood Wall has that same connotation, the mural on the wall changes your mind a little bit when you look at it.
I suspect there are stories like this all over the country. I think we have to teach kids, give them a sense of place, and you do that by letting them know what's down the block.
Almost 200 people are dead and hundreds are still missing after record flooding sweeps through Western Europe, hitting parts of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. German Chancellor Angela Merkel toured the damage yesterday, promising federal aid to rebuild. NBC News global correspondent Raf Sanchez is in Durnau, Germany. So, Raf, search and rescue teams, they've been sifting through the damage to find survivors here. I see night has fallen. Have the search efforts ended for the day?
Search efforts do seem to have ended for the moment, but all day here we have seen police, military, and volunteers coming in and out of this town. The River R is only about 50 yards that way, so this has really been ground zero in terms of the flood zone. Lindsay, as you said, across Western Europe, the death toll now at around 200. Here in Germany, it's about at 160, and there are still more than 300 people missing across the entire country. There's been a lot of confusion about the numbers over the last couple of days, but German authorities confirming to NBC News that in this state alone, there are 150 people still unaccounted for. Now, you can see the water here, which previously was above the first floor of houses in this village, has receded, and that means police and other searchers for the first time are starting to get into basements and other areas that were previously inaccessible. And they have the grim task of looking for some of those missing people down in the mud there. There is a consensus in this country. This death toll is going to rise. The question is, by how much? Lindsay?
I mean, Raf, let's talk about infrastructure. For example, I think you're at a gas station, and I think it also speaks to how catastrophic this flooding is, that I'm only 50% sure that you are, in fact, in front of a gas station because the damage is so bad there. I mean, what's the damage here to roadways, to transportation?
Yeah, Lindsay, we are at the remains of a gas station, I would say. It is almost post-apocalyptic here. Germany boasts some of the best infrastructure in the world. A lot of it has been hammered by the floodwater. There is actually a train line just over that way. And like the railway infrastructure in all parts of this region, buried in some places underneath mud and debris. You mentioned night has fallen. There is no electricity in this town, as there is no electricity in many parts of Western Germany. Our crew's lights here are pretty much the only lights on right now. The German finance minister says the government will provide $350 million, 300 million euros in an immediate short-term relief and reconstruction package to try to get this region back on its feet. But over the long term, they are looking at billions needed to rebuild this area. And the German government is saying it is committed to doing that. Lindsay?
You know, Raf, when we talk about finding those missing, is it that they're trying to go essentially flat by flat and figure out who was here, who was on holiday?
That's exactly right. They basically are trying to piece together what did this area look like before the floodwater came, because some parts of it are unrecognizable. And many of the houses here, we're in a very steep valley, so the water just pushed up against the side of the valley. Many of these houses have basements. Volunteers here have described those basements being completely full of hardened mud. So it is going to take a long time to scoop out that debris and sediment and see what's underneath it. Lindsay?
Oh, my gosh, what an undertaking. All right, Raf Sanchez, very sobering report. Thank you so much. We are less than 24 hours away from Jeff Bezos blasting off into space. The Blue Origin crew is making its final preparations for tomorrow morning's launch. NBC News correspondent Tom Costello is in West Texas with a preview.
The launch pad in the West Texas desert is set, the clock ticking down to Blue Origin's first human test flight.
The vehicle is ready. The crew is ready.
2, 1. For an 11-minute round-trip ride to space.
And we have liftoff. Go, New Shepard, go.
Already, Blue Origin has flown 15 unmanned test flights, but it's never carried humans until now. Climbing aboard for the inaugural flight Tuesday, billionaire founder Jeff Bezos and his brother Mark, and 82-year-old veteran pilot Wally Funk.
We're going to fly you up into space on the very first flight. That's your
Funk has dreamed of going to space since joining NASA's Mercury 13 astronaut program in the 1960s, only to be grounded because of her gender. She'll be joined by 18-year-old Oliver Damon from the Netherlands, the first paying passenger thanks to his father. Funk and Damon will become the oldest and youngest people ever to fly in space, climbing 62 miles high beyond the Kármán line where space begins. Number 6, Jeff Bezos. This is where he'll sit.
That is where Jeff Bezos is going to sit, is in seat number 6.
Late Sunday, Blue Origin took us inside the simulator that all 4 have been training in.
There you go. You are all buckled in and ready to go to space. So
This is a big window.
that as you're ascending, you see, essentially it feels like the earth is falling away from you.
Once in space, 3 to 4 minutes of weightlessness, floating free.
Oh, this is unbelievable. This is too unbelievable.
Tomorrow's launch comes just 9 days after Richard Branson won the so-called billionaire space race with Virgin Galactic's first passenger test flight, landing on a New Mexico runway, while Bezos paying passengers
And touchdown.
are promised a soft landing in the West Texas desert.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.